start then, and hopefully John will join me along the way. So first of all, it's a pleasure to be here today with you, and to have Tyler defending his thesis on beach variability. I'll talk to you a little bit about Tyler, and also want to thank, first of all, Tyler's family for attending today. His dad, his mom, brother, grandma. No grandma's here. So I hope you ask questions at the end of the friends, and they're counting on you. And also I'd like to thank the Geological Lab for setting up the food and drinks outside. And also Tyler's advisors, at least one of them is present right now, also John Warwick. So we have Tom Connolly, she's the oceanographer here, and John Warwick, who's a USGS marine scientist. So they were very important in helping Tyler through this work. So Tyler joined Mossman in 2015. Good job. And and he came from San Diego State University, where he obtained his bachelor's degree in 2015 with University of San Diego. Sorry, these are glasses. University of San Diego.
My dad went to stay.
I got both CDs. And his advisor was Sarah Gray, and so he was working on land-based pollution in the U.S. Virgin Islands, so kind of a different setting than here. But actually, before going to University of San Diego, he was for 3 semesters in New York. I have to talk about your real life, where he was studying musical theater, and his career, as you can see, continued in the kind of performing arts. Right? And I understand how he went through 2 different passions, one for arts, music, and acting, and the other one is for the environment. So that's what kind of was the conundrum in Tyler's career. Eventually, he decided that working in environmental projects was actually his true nature. So he came back to California, and well, now he's here with us. In the last 3 years, Tyler has been not only very productive, and he has been working on his thesis pretty much since the start here, taking advantage of El Nino. We took advantage of El Nino. Only few people can say that. And you'll learn more about that today. But also, he was actually able to work very different jobs. First of all, he worked for me actually twice as a teaching assistant for geological oceanography and habitat mapping, so it was very valuable help with classes. He also worked with the wetland group in many projects since actually September 2015, so pretty much since the start. He was involved in Ross Clark's group, and that was actually a great opportunity not only to support himself, but also to learn about different techniques and approaches in coastal environmental studies. He was also working as a research assistant for me. Actually, I was working on a coast grant to look at the beach variability in Monterey Bay, so I supported him for about half a year. He also received several grants and awards, some of which are the WAVE Scholarship, the Graduate Student Research Award, and the Richard Chambers Memorial Scholarship from the Northern California Geological Society. So he was able to obtain different scholarships. In the meantime, he's also a research mentor for REU, so we have a student here for a summer, and the student learned a lot working with Tyler in the field. And he was also a science mentor for the watch program at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. So a lot of very intense last 3 years, which I think Tyler was able really to reconcile working, learning, and working on his thesis. So I'm not now let you define your thesis, but I want to say that this is really the first time in which any researchers has looked at this scale of beach variability, both in terms of spatial scales, but also the frequency of the surveys. And today you're going to learn a lot about new things about beaches that we really didn't know until before Tyler started this project. So there's a lot of follow-up studies I think that will follow you. Enjoy the defense. There will be time for questions, about 10 minutes at the end, I hope. And go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Ivana, for that wonderful introduction. The
title of my thesis defense is Assessing Beach Variability and Shoreline Change at a Monterey Bay Beach. And there's quite a bit that I'm going to cover here today, and so I just want to present a little outline showing you what am I really trying to do here. Basically, I'm trying to create these high-frequency three-dimensional maps of a single beach, meaning that I'm going back to the same beach over and over again, creating a map of the beach to assess beach change in terms of volume and shoreline. And I'm doing this over a couple different temporal scales, one being over the short term, so over the course of months to about a year or so, and then the other one over the course of a longer term time scale, meaning years to a decade or two. The structure of my presentation will be as follows. I'll begin with an introduction, move into my methods, then get into some results and discussion, finally present a few concluding remarks. So let's jump right into it, get into my introduction. So why are we here today? Why are beaches important? Why have I been spending so much time studying them? Well, they provide important ecological habitat for various organisms: sand dwellers, shorebirds, fish, mammals, dune plants. And so if we were to lose these beaches, that would represent a loss of habitat for these organisms. And with that, I just want to warn all the biologists in the room, that is the first and last mention of any biology in my entire defense. So good luck, I guess. Moving forward here, beaches also provide important recreational areas and thus help local economies. For example, in Monterey Bay, beaches are our largest draw for tourism. So if we were to lose our beaches, local economies would surely suffer. And finally, beaches provide a buffer to storms and sea level rise. Just want to provide a quick little example here. These two photos were taken up in Pacifica, California, which is located just south of the mouth of the San Francisco Bay. And this photo up here in the upper left just shows this highly eroded beach which has exposed the adjacent sea cliff, leaving it vulnerable to any sort of large storm events. And as a result, you end up with what you can see over here on the right-hand side, where we have this apartment complex essentially dangling off the side of this cliff. And so this is just one example of why having these broad, healthy beaches is extremely important to protect our coastlines. And beaches have been in the headlines quite a bit lately. This first headline I find really amusing. Southern California coast could be toast by 2100. And what each of these headlines have in common is that they're all pulling from this one study done by the USGS. In this study, they're trying to create a model for shoreline change and predict how our beaches are going to change. And they suggest that 31 to 67% of Southern California beaches may become completely eroded by 2100. This is a pretty grim prediction. However, we need to remember that this is really just a model. They're trying to predict what's going to happen in the future. And there are all sorts of assumptions that go into this model. Some of them come from real data, but not all of it. For example, HAF in 2013 talks about this spectrum when it comes to modeling, where you have engineered systems, you have natural systems, and then you have everything in between. And how the closer you are to a natural system, i.e. a beach environment, the more complex it is to model changes and predict perturbations to that system. Pilkey et al. In 2013 goes on and uses some fairly colorful language, suggesting that models are now standard weapons in society's assault on the world's coast. This comes straight from a scientific paper, and I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say this. However, I think that it's just highlighting the fact that it's still extremely valuable to go out and collect true field data to describe what's going on our beaches, and also to validate these models and improve them for the future. Before I go any further, I just wanted to define some general terms and go over some concepts as well. First off is shoreline. You'll hear me refer to this throughout the talk. And a shoreline can be defined by several different parameters, from the high water line, the wet-dry line, the dune toe, to tidal datums. And that last one, a tidal datum, is what has been commonly used, especially recently. And this photo, or this figure over here on the right-hand side, shows all the tidal datums for Monterey, California. For those of you who don't know, a tidal datum is just a standard elevation defined by a certain phase of the tide. So here we're thinking things like mean sea level or mean high or high water, which is shown here in the figure as MSL or MHW. And the great thing about this is that it describes local tidal conditions, but they're all referenced to these national elevations as well, so that you can compare tides between Monterey and San Diego, for example. Another term that I'll refer to is volume, which I know you all know what volume is, but I'm referring here to the amount of sand on the beach at any given time. Shorelines and volumes are often talked about in terms of erosion or accretion, which is just the loss of sand or gaining of sand. And the figure over here on the right is showing the position of the shoreline and how it changes throughout time. So each of those lines represents a contour of a tidal datum, and it's showing the on and offshore movement of that datum in time, which is associated with erosion and accretion. In terms of volume, you can see this cartoonish cross-section here of a beach where we feature an eroded profile and an accreted profile, and these would correspond to low volumes on the beach and high volumes on the beach. This describes the on and offshore movement of sand. However, within the natural environment, things are slightly more complex than that. For example, littoral cells are very typical of active margins such as California. California has all these discontinuities such as promontories and submarine canyons, and this is why we have the development of all these different littoral cells, meaning in southern Monterey Bay, for example, we have these cutoffs for sediment transport at the Monterey Peninsula, as well as up here where the Monterey Bay submarine canyon tributary is. And so this means that sediment transport is confined within this cell, and there are distinct areas where sand is sourced, where it's lost, or the sand sinks, as well as the transportation pathways within a littoral cell. And within southern Monterey Bay, sand can be sourced from two main areas, the first one being the Salinas River right here, in which we have episodic discharge events whenever the Salinas River mouth is breached. This doesn't happen as often as you might think, really only every few years, in which the river discharges large amounts of sand into the system and other associated sediments. A second sand source is dune erosion, which can occur in any portion of southern Monterey Bay. However, I've labeled the Fort Ord dune erosion down in Marina because Fort Ord has been identified as contributing a significant amount of sand into the system. Once within the littoral cell, the sand is then available for transportation along the beach. And these arrows here are showing the dominant transportation direction. However, this is a function of wave height and the angle that the wave comes in to the shore. And so you can imagine that the direction of these arrows might change depending on oceanographic conditions. For example, if we get a swell coming in from the north, it's going to tend to push sediment to the south along these beaches, whereas if we get a swell from the south, it's going to push sand north along the beach. Finally, the sand is lost to the system in a few distinct areas, one being the Monterey Bay submarine canyon up here on the northern portion of the cell. So any sort of sand that is transported to the north is intercepted by the canyon, transported offshore, and lost to the system forever. Next, we have the CMEX sand mine located down here in Marina. This is a private sand mine that is still operational to this day that is extracting a natural resource, sand, from a national marine sanctuary. They are phasing out of operation, but they're still doing this today. Finally, we have offshore transport down here in southern regions of the bay. This occurs due to these strong rip currents that form and then suck sand away from the system. So now that I've gone over some of these general terms and concepts, I want to get into a few studies that are describing beach change. First off, we have Hapke et al. In 2009, which try to characterize coastal change in all of California, a very large-scale study. And they do this over two different time periods, over the long term and the short term, which they define as about 120 years and 25 years. And here they suggest that 40% of beaches have experienced long-term beach erosion, where we see an increase to 66% of beaches experiencing short-term beach erosion. They then go on to single out Monterey Bay as having the highest long-term beach erosion rate in all of California. And then over the short term, you'll notice that that rate increases, even though it may not be the highest in the state at this point. Here I'm showing just some data presented within this study. And the y-axis here represents a spatial scale, where on top we have Moss Landing, and as we move down the graph, we move south towards the marina area. The x-axis here represents shoreline change rates, where negative values to the right are erosional change rates, and positive values to the left are accretional change rates. The two different colored lines represent the two spatial scales, so purple is long-term, green is short-term. And the big takeaway from this graph is just that even in a place like southern Monterey Bay, which has been identified as having these extremely high rates of erosion, you still see plenty of both spatial and temporal variability, meaning that down here in Marina, both long and short-term change rates are highly erosional. However, if we look up at where we're at in Moss Landing, there's a discrepancy temporally here where we have long-term accretion and short-term erosion. A couple of things to keep in mind about this study is that even though it covers over a century, it's relying on extremely low temporal resolution. So there's only a few points in time where they actually have measurements to come to these conclusions. However, they cite the fact that change is highly episodic. And so it makes sense that perhaps if we were to sample more frequently, we would learn more and more about this change that's occurring. And that's exactly what Dingler and Rice do in their study, where they're looking at changes to Monterey Bay beaches from the end of the 82-83 El Nino through the 97-98 El Nino. And here, they're sampling more frequently, so about twice a year, once in the summer, once in the winter, and they find that the beaches are highly variable, which is what you can see here in this figure, in which we have these beach profiles within southern Monterey Bay. So over here on the right, these are the dunes, and as we move to the left, we move through the beach and then into the nearshore environment. And they go on and they link the extreme erosion events that they observed to the El Nino winters in which they cover. However, even during normal winters, they still measure quite a bit of variability, and they suggest that beaches erode during winter wave conditions and accrete during summer wave conditions. This is an observation that was not first made by Dingler and Reese. For example, Shepard made this observation back in 1950 down in San Diego. Since then, several researchers have found the same exact thing. However, one thing that all of these studies have in common is that they're still relying on relatively low temporal resolution. You know, one data point in the summer, one data point in the winter. However, the change that occurs is much quicker than that. And so I had the idea of going out there and trying to survey at high frequency intervals, meaning about once a month or so. And I needed to choose a beach to do this at, so I decided on Moss Landing Beach up here in the north, which I will consistently refer to as MLB. To give you a little bit of context, the beach is located just south of our Moss Landing Aquaculture Center. And you'll notice here that this is relatively small spatial scale, which is just something that you have to give up if you want to do these high frequency surveying. It's just a trade-off. And I chose Moss Landing Beach for a couple reasons. First of all, it's in this really peculiar area of the littoral cell, right on the northern node of the cell, and just adjacent to the Monterey Bay submarine canyon. And so it's really this last beach on a long line of beaches that the sediment reaches before it is lost to the system forever. The overall goal of this study is to use high-frequency surveying techniques to characterize beach change at MLB from the winter of 2015-16 through summer 2017. From this goal, I had two questions. First off, does MLB follow expected seasonal trends of erosion during winter conditions and accretion during summer conditions? I'm expecting that MLB volume and shoreline measurements will trend towards erosion during winter conditions and accretion during summer conditions. I'm thinking of this because of all the researchers, such as Dingler and Reese, that have shown just that. My second question is, has the recent erosional trend in shoreline change rate measured by Hapke et al. In 2009 at MLB continued? I'm expecting here that the MLB shoreline will have eroded since 2002. All right, so now I'm going to move on to my methods. In order to extract parameters such as volumes and shorelines, I needed a way of mapping the beach. So I relied on terrestrial laser scanning. This figure over here, this photo on the left, shows me setting up our terrestrial laser scanner. The model is a Trimble VX spatial station, and it relies on terrestrial light detection and ranging, or terrestrial LiDAR for topographic mapping. It's remotely operated by this TSC2 controller, and the basic way in which this works is that the station uses backscatter measurements of near-infrared laser to set up a triangular network for mapping. I'll go into just a little bit more detail here. So each survey begins by setting up these foresights and backsights, which are just fixed points of known coordinates. We know these coordinates because we use a differential GPS to locate them. The foresight and backsight are made up of just these long pieces of rebar, fence posts, or any sort of existing monument that you know is going to stay fixed during the duration of your study so that you can revisit it time and time again as a reliable point. You then go and you set your station up over the foresight. You make sure it's level and you measure the station height. From here, you're able to locate the station in relation to the foresight. Next, you set up a survey rod with a prism over the backsight, make sure that's level, and you also record that height. The station then emits these pulses of near-infrared laser and measures the backscatter of that laser. Here it's able to assess the time of flight, and with that you're able to calculate the distance between the foresight and the backsight using the equation shown above. You then use a series of trigonometric functions such as the law of sines to set up this triangulation network. And this is just the basis of any sort of surveying. So whether it's me running around out there on the beach or it's the Caltrans employees out on Highway 1 doing their surveys, we're all relying on this same method of setting up this triangulation network for mapping purposes. The laser scanner that we use has two different modes for collecting points. The first mode is direct reflect mode, which I've shown a cartoon here depicting just that, in which the station scans whatever it has a line of sight with, and then for that surface, you get this point cloud shown here, and each of those points has an associated latitude, longitude, and elevation, allowing you to set up a three-dimensional model of whatever you are scanning. However, you don't always have a line of sight with everything you want to map, and so there is a second mode called prism mode. So I have a prism fixed on top of a wheel-mounted survey rod right here, and the station is able to lock onto the prism and follow me as I walk around the beach, collecting points all along the way. This is extremely valuable because I'm able to wade into the intertidal. Also, my volunteers are able to wade into the intertidal at times too, and I'm also able to map around these large features on the beach, such as prominent beach berms that I don't necessarily have a line of sight with. So terrestrial laser scanning is thought of as being extremely accurate and precise, but of course it does come with its set of caveats. First off, there's beam intensity, which fluctuates as a function of angle, distance, and surface properties. Here I'm showing a survey done by a former student, Charlie, where he surveyed this marsh right here in this mud flat, and you'll notice that we get low intensity returns here in the blue on these wet areas, but along the edge where things are much more dry, you get a higher intensity return. We also need to consider beam divergence. So as the laser is emitted from the station, the footprint of the laser will grow in size as a function of angle and distance. Now, I bring up these caveats because I think it's good science. However, as Charlie's thesis and other studies have shown, terrestrial laser scanners are extremely accurate down to the millimeter scale often, if not sometimes the centimeter scale. And so a lot of these large meter scale changes we're seeing on beaches are easily going to be picked up by the terrestrial laser scanner. And so at the end of a survey, you hope to end up with something kind of like this. This would be a point cloud where each of these dots has a corresponding lat long and elevation. However, things don't always start out quite so clean. Here we're looking down on a point cloud where this orange triangle up top represents the location of the station. And as we move away from the station, you'll notice that the point density decreases quite a bit. The reason for this is that this beach was surveyed in one single scan using direct reflect mode. And so in order to correct for this discrepancy in point density, we break our surveys up into many different scans using direct reflect. So the different colors here show the different scans. And you'll notice that in the north to south direction, there's quite a bit of uniformity among when it comes to point density. However, here on the outer edge of the survey, there is quite a bit of noise in the data, and that's just inherent to any sort of terrestrial laser scanning. Luckily, we're able to clean up the data and end up with something looking like this. However, I also need to add in the points collected using prism mode, and we end up with a complete survey, as you can see over there on the right-hand side. Once I have all my surveys, I need a way of calculating volume change. So I developed this methodology for calculating volume differentials between consecutive surveys. So here I have an example of survey 1 and survey 2. However, you're not able to simply compare point clouds, so I needed to create surfaces across these point clouds. I did this in ArcMap, in which I interpolated over the point clouds from a triangular irregular network. From here, I go ahead and I subtract the two surfaces, and I end up with the result shown over here on the right, where the warm colors represent positive volume change and the cool colors represent negative volume change. The great thing about this, this surface is that it's a raster surface, meaning that it's composed of thousands of equal area cells, each with their own individual elevation change value. So I'm able to export this data into tabular form and calculate total volume change, divide that by total area to get volume differentials in meters cubed per meter squared. The reason here that I'm dividing by area is to account for discrepancies in the spatial extent from one survey to the next. After volume change, I wanted to calculate shoreline change. So this surface over here on the right is just from one of my surveys, and you'll notice the black line going down it, which represents the mean higher high water contour. Mean higher high water is one of the tidal datums I referred to earlier. And to give you a bit more context, this is the predictions for the tide charts today in Monterey. And California is characterized by what's called mixed semi-diurnal tides, meaning that every day we have 2 low tides and 2 high tides of different elevations. And mean higher high water is the mean of this highest value over the course of 19 years. And so for each of my surveys, I have created this mean higher high water contour to represent my shorelines. From here, I needed a way of quantifying the change from one contour or one shoreline to the next. And so I used the digital shoreline analysis system, which is an extensional tool to ArcGIS developed in part by the USGS, which calculates the distance from a baseline. You have to draw your own baseline within this tool, and so this black line here on the right-hand side is the baseline that I drew. And the whole idea behind this baseline is it's supposed to be this best fit line for all of your shorelines, which you then locate on shore. From here, the tool then casts these transects perpendicular to the baseline, and it goes from one transect to the next, calculating the distance from each shoreline to the baseline, so that from here you can get shoreline position relative to the baseline, as well as shoreline change from one survey to the next. Now I just want to give a little bit of metadata. So I completed 23 surveys between February 2016 and June 2017, and I was also lucky enough to pull from an additional data set. Ivano completed 15 surveys between 2007 and 2010, which I was also lucky enough to use for my research. Finally, I needed a way of delineating between seasons. After all, my first question asks about beach change in relation to winter and summer conditions, but what does that really mean? Seasons have been defined by many different researchers. You can see they use all these different parameters, including a combination of all of the above. However, my study is just assuming that it's the wave regime that's driving beach change, and so I relied on the wave regime to define my seasonality. Now, I'm dealing with two different time periods, 2016 through 2017, as well as 2007 through 2010. And so I did the seasonal delineation for both of those time periods. This first one here is for 2016 through 17, where I have significant wave height plotted here on the y-axis. And this comes from a CDIP buoy within Monterey Bay. I noticed pretty easily here that there's this pretty clear delineation at this 4-meter threshold, where during winter months, highlighted here in orange, we get a high frequency of waves above the 4-meter mark, versus summer conditions in which we have no waves above that threshold. And this happens pretty cleanly in the month of May, where we get this transition from winter to summer conditions, and then at some point in October we get a transition back from summer conditions back into winter conditions. So for my other time period, 07 to 10, unfortunately I had to use a different buoy because of data availability, and because this different buoy was in another location, my threshold changed. The threshold shifted from 4 meters to 3 meters. However, I still get this very clear delineation where every single May you get the change from winter to summer conditions, and then in October you get a change from summer to winter conditions. And this is how I was able to delineate between these wave conditions for MLB. All right, finally, we're going to get into some results and discussion. This slide here is showing beach volume and shoreline change at MLB from 2016 through 2017, where the top panel is volume, bottom panel, shoreline, and these are each plotted cumulatively so that we can track their changes throughout time. The dots represent the average value, and the envelopes aren't actually error bars. Instead, these are standard deviations, which can be thought of as being representative of the spatial variability of the given parameter. So my hypothesis here was that during summer conditions, where we have the blue shading here, I would see an accretion trend, meaning a positive trend in the data, whereas during winter conditions, shown here in the orange shading, I would see a negative trend in the data, or an erosional trend. However, taking a look at the data here, that is not necessarily the case. During the winter conditions in orange, you'll notice that yes, there's plenty of erosion occurring, but there's also quite a bit of accretion as well. And if we contrast that to the summer conditions here in blue, you'll see that there's just not that much going on during the summer on the beaches. And this is shown here by the means of the data, but if we take a look at the envelopes around the data, you might come to a similar conclusion, where during summer conditions, those envelopes are quite small, meaning that there's very little spatial variability within these parameters, versus winter conditions, where we're seeing a high amount of variability. And so here I would suggest that winter conditions are characterized by high beach variability, whereas summer conditions are characterized by low beach variability. Here I plot just some of the shoreline change data from 2007 to 2009, and I won't get too much into this because the temporal resolution isn't quite as fine. However, we do have quite a bit of data for these two winters, and you'll notice that it supports my findings from before that suggest high beach variability during winter conditions, where you not only see erosion, but you also see accretion on the beach. This is just a way of looking at the data in a slightly different way, where I have shoreline change on the x-axis and volume differential on the y-axis. And you notice this positive relationship in the data, which turns out to be significant. I have this low p-value over here and a fairly high r-squared value, which would then suggest that as shoreline change accretes, volume differentials also accrete, and vice versa with erosion. These points are also colored based on season, so the orange is winter, blue is summer. And what you'll notice is that the orange color is all over the place. There's extreme erosion as well as extreme accretion occurring during these winter conditions, whereas the blue is more confined to the center here. There's just not nearly as much change occurring. So again, we're seeing high variability winters, low variability summers. So why the waves, they're not necessarily driving erosion or accretion over these short time periods. Instead, they seem to be driving variability. And here, I present a way of thinking a little bit more about what's driving this short-term erosion and accretion, where now the points are all colored by the antecedent shoreline position, which I know sounds very confusing, so let me go ahead and break it down for you all a little bit. So antecedent shoreline position, we have the red means erosion, the blue means accretion, and the 0 here is the mean shoreline position for each of my surveys. And so for this red dot that you see up here in the upper right, I would interpret this as the dot represents a comparison between 2 consecutive surveys, where the first of those surveys, because it's red, suggests that the shoreline position began in this highly eroded position. However, because it is plotted in the upper right, it would suggest that the subsequent response was for accretion to occur. Whereas this deep blue dot right here is, again, the comparison between 2 consecutive surveys, where the first survey, because it's blue, began in this accreted position, and the subsequent response was for erosion to occur. And you'll see that there's a lot of grouping here for the colors, which would then suggest that the antecedent shoreline position, or the antecedent state, is highly predictive of whether you're going to see short-term erosion or accretion on these beaches. And so we have waves driving variability on a seasonal scale, but then we have this idea of geomorphologic inheritance, which drives short-term erosion or accretion. What I mean by that is it's very difficult to erode an already eroded beach, but if you have an accreted beach, it doesn't take that much wave energy to cause quite a bit of erosion. So this is all describing high-frequency beach change, and now I want to get into longer-term changes on the beach. So here I have both batches of data. I have the data from 2007 to 2010, as well as 2016 through 17, and the y-axis here is shoreline position. What I love about this graph is that it captures the high-frequency variability that I've been describing, but we're also able to discern this longer-term positive trend. And if I go ahead and complete an independent t-test comparing the means for each batch of shoreline positions, I get a very low p-value suggesting that there is a statistically significant difference between these 2 data sets, which equates to about 1 meter per year of accretion. However, on this graph, there are plenty of gaps in between these batches of data, as well as going all the way back here. And so I wanted to fill in some of these gaps, and I brought in some external data. This external data is plotted here on the x's, and I got the data from NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. So these are just large statewide LiDAR flights, which I have clipped down to the extent of MLB and calculated their shoreline positions. And for the data that's overlapping my data sets over here, it's actually in agreement with the accretion trend which I've measured. However, if we look back in time, back to 1997, we see this erosional trend which is extremely reminiscent of the Hapke et al. Trend, which measured short-term beach erosion at MLB. And so it seems like over the course of this 20-year period from 97 to 2017, we're seeing this shoreline oscillation at Moss Landing Beach. And from here, I was curious as to what might be driving these oscillations. So to explain this, I looked at a study done by Smith et al. These are our colleagues down at CSUMB who completed 7 bathymetric surveys from 2002 to 2005, in which they note the gradual buildup and then episodic erosion or failure of the canyon head at the Moss Landing submarine canyon right here. And so what this is showing is that the Monterey Bay submarine canyon is extremely dynamic. Over the course of a few years, it can build up and erode quite a bit. And then if we take a look at the study done by Monk and Traylor in 1947, they go ahead and they connect some of these canyon head dynamics to what we're seeing on the adjacent beaches in terms of shoreline positions. For example, you can see here that we have a canyon head, and then these lines represent the waves. And you'll see that around the canyon, we get the refraction of the waves, or the bending of the waves. And the result of this is for the outward transport. And so we can think of these canyon head dynamics as being a source of sand to the adjacent beaches, meaning that as the canyon builds up, there's more sand available for transport to beaches such as Moss Landing Beach, whereas when it erodes, there's less sand available for transport to these beaches. We must also consider wave energy, because as waves interact with the canyon head, they lose a lot of their energy, and so with that, as the canyon head moves offshore and onshore, that could impact how much energy is reaching Moss Landing Beach, which might also result in shifts in these shoreline positions. So this is just one example of a local factor that might be affecting the shoreline position of MLB. However, there are other larger scale global factors that could be influencing MLB as well, such as El Nino Southern Oscillation, as well as the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. And there have been many studies linking these large-scale climate patterns to changes on the beach. One of which I've talked about a little bit earlier in the study, which was Dingler and Rice in 2002. And here I've created a cartoon which just depicts a concept that Dingler and Rice described in their study for changes to Monterey Bay beaches as a result of El Nino Southern Oscillation trends. So essentially what they're stating is that the beach has three different states. The first state being extreme erosion, which is often associated with our El Nino winters. The second state being recovery, associated with La Nina time periods. And finally, we go into this normal variability where we have a normal wave regime, followed by, once again, another El Nino. And so what I really like about this concept is that you'll notice all of this up and down, this high frequency variability, which is very reminiscent of the variability that I've measured within my high frequency surveying. However, we also see these longer time scale oscillations in shoreline position, reminiscent of the longer time scale oscillations that I've measured at MLB as well. All right, finally, I'm going to end up with some concluding statements here. I want to revisit my goals and my questions. My goal was to use high-frequency surveying techniques to characterize beach change at MLB from winter 2015-16 through summer 2017. I'll go ahead and say that I accomplished that goal, and I also answered my two questions. My first question was, does MLB follow expected seasonal trends of erosion during winter conditions and accretion during summer conditions? And I'm suggesting no, this is not the case. Instead of erosion and accretion, what we're seeing is that MLB volume and shoreline measurements feature high variability winters and low variability summers. My second question is, has the recent erosional trend in shoreline change rate measured by Hapke et al. 2009 at MLB continued? No, it has not. Instead, the MLB shoreline has accreted from 2007 to 2017. And just to expand on this a little bit, I want to remind us all that the beach I focused on was Moss Landing Beach, located at the most northern portion of our littoral cell. So it's in this very peculiar area, right at the northern node of the cell, and it's receiving quite a bit of sediment transported here from the south. And there's also all sorts of complications that arise due to the presence of this massive feature on the ocean floor. And as a result, we have this beach that's acting very abnormally compared to some other beaches, in which these summer and winter wave conditions don't necessarily correspond to erosion and accretion, but instead correspond to magnitudes of variability. over short time periods. However, if we want to predict erosion and accretion, we need to consider geomorphologic inheritance, meaning that an eroded shoreline isn't likely to erode very much more over short time scales versus an accreted shoreline. And so this describes the high frequency variability. However, this high frequency variability is often embedded over longer term change. So these decadal scale changes in which we're seeing shoreline oscillations at Moss Landing Beach, which can be connected to both local and global factors such as submarine canyon dynamics, as well as global climate patterns such as El Nino Southern Oscillation. And finally, before I end today, I just have so many people that I'd like to thank. Ivano, thank you so much. You have been a phenomenal advisor. I have just loved working with you. Honestly, I wish I could keep working with you, but seriously, I've very rarely come across an educator who cares as much about the work as they do the students. And so thank you so much for all your hard work. Tom, I think you're still there. Thank you so much for everything you've done. You know, you've been advising me on this project since the very beginning as well, and you've helped me out with understanding, in particular, how these wave complexities may be influencing what I'm seeing on the beaches, as well as some of these basic ideas in modeling shoreline change. I also want to add that I've taken 2 classes with you since I've been at Moss Landing, and those have been 2 of the better classes I've ever taken in my academic career, so thank you so much for that. John, I hope you joined us at some point throughout this talk. Thank you for being on my committee. You know, early on you gave me a few pieces of literature that first introduced me to this idea of geomorphologic inheritance. And I've honestly been staring at a couple key figures that you sent me 3 years ago for the past 3 years, and I think it's really helped me explain what I've been seeing here in my results. The GeoOsh Lab, you guys have been great. Most of you have volunteered your time and been out in the field with me, so thank you so much. You also helped me with edits on this defense, and you've provided refreshments today, so thank you. You guys are awesome. CCWG, in particularly Ross and Kevin, thank you guys so much. You have employed me during my past 3 years here, which means that I've been able to pay rent on time every month, which has been awesome. But even more so, I've really loved the work. It's so great when you can come to grad school and be able to do your own research project, but then also be able to do research on all these other projects and get paid to do it. And so I've had so much fun, and I've really been able to hone my skills as a scientist. So thank you. Tara, you are an awesome student coordinator. We've been here the same amount of time now, and since you've stepped in, I've noticed some pretty great changes with the program, which I know will only continue, so thank you so much for your hard work. The facilities crew, you know, these guys are always there for us no matter what we want, so thank you guys. Sarah, you know I love you. You're awesome. You're such a great support for me. Yeah, Mom, what more can I say, you know? Mom and Dad, you guys, I owe everything to you two. You guys are insane. You supported me when I wanted to study musical theater at NYU. Just a crazy idea for an 18-year-old, but I loved it. It was so much fun. And then you supported me when I decided that I wanted to switch over to science, even though throughout all of high school I proclaimed that I hated science. And so things have changed, kind of, yeah. So thank you so much. And then to all of my funding agencies, including the Moss Landing student body, as all of you know, being a grad student, every little bit helps. So thank you so much. And with that, I'll take any questions. Kevin?
Two questions. The first one was, so where you did all your beach work, that's right in front of the whole lab, that dune was built.
Right.
were just talking about this the other
Yeah.
day.
I'm just wondering, do you think that would, since it was a building and then another building went away and built a new, what kind of effect did you get that on your research? And then the other was, you picked a very unique location along the whole coast, as you said, for Monterey Bay, and you think that your hypothesis may have been actually true in other locations.
Sure.
Further down the coast, closer to the marina or something.
Well, let me start with the second question. I do not think I would have gotten the same results. I didn't show everything that I've done here at Moss Landing over the past 3 years, but I have done a bit of surveying at other beaches as well. And just based on some of the results that I'm seeing there, a lot of the beaches seem to be acting slightly more as you might expect, where they just tend to erode throughout winter and then accrete. In terms of the timing of that, I'm not entirely sure, but I don't think you would see quite as much variability at those beaches. Even if you walk 200 meters south of Moss Landing Beach, for example, and I think that's mostly due to the wave interactions with the submarine canyon. And then to answer your first question about our lab used to be right there, I think that all the data that I've presented comes after that, but that's certainly not to say that it didn't influence what's going on there now. I mean, like I said, geomorphologic inheritance is kind of this broad term, and you could even think about that in terms of your question. But I'm not sure how it would necessarily influence it. I'm unfamiliar with the layout of the old lab. I mean, I don't know if there were any seawalls or anything like that. Yeah, there were seawalls. Well, there are plenty of studies that show that seawalls are ineffective. They actually erode the beach quite a bit. And so, yeah, it could be influencing what's going on there.
Yeah, so you may have just answered this with Kevin's, but it seems to me that, at least on that beach, that you're suggesting that accretions are happening even during winter time, and that the only time that erosion is really happening is some really high frequency event, like we get a winter storm come through. A lot of big waves come through, moves the sand offshore, that storm passes through, and then it starts accreting again. And so you get this fluctuation. So if you were doing it more frequently than you did, you'd probably see this even more rapid change in beach volume and stuff during the winter.
Right. So
true.
Yeah. So one of the difficulties of doing this kind of work is that I'm trying to capture these storm events, but I can't be out there when there's a storm. And so it's trying to narrow that window where I go out right before the storm and right after the storm, because I started noticing that even if I go out a few days after a storm, I will often miss that low point in erosion, because you just see this rapid pulse of sand that gets deposited on the beach after these large erosional events.
And the second part is, we now know that, and you just showed it with the work that the CSU and you guys did, that we get this big mass of sand that piles up right outside where the lab used to sit. And it'll sit there for years and years and years, and then all of a sudden, we think, flush down the canyon. So how do you think having that big blob of sand offshore for years and years and years might be affecting the characteristics you're watching on the beach side through the last couple of years?
Right. So I kind of touched on that a little bit, but I think that some of the main ways that it could be influencing it has to do with just the way that the waves are interacting with the head of the submarine canyon. Because if you go and you hang out there on any given day, you'll notice that the waves right there near Moss Landing Beach are very strange. Some amazing surf out there every once in a while, but you just get the breakdown of energy over the submarine canyon. And so if we're changing the bathymetry out there, bathymetry is really what is controlling so much of wave angle as well as wave energy, and so that could be influencing what we're seeing on shore. So it's almost like the sand that's deposited out there could be influencing the waves, but it could also act as a storage area for sand that could be potentially transported on shore.
And the last one is, so what's going to happen now that the sand plant's going to stop?
We don't know. We have no idea.
What's your what do you think is going to happen?
You know, there are some people, so down where the sand plant is, past the Salinas River mouth, down there in Marina, there is plenty of dune erosion occurring there on pretty large scales. And you can talk to certain researchers who will tell you that the sand eroding from the dunes there never comes up to Moss Landing. Just based on physical properties, the physics aren't there. It's not going to be transported all the way up here into the canyon. However, there are others, such as myself, who think that, I don't know, I think it's possible, especially if you consider the fact that you get these large waves that are coming in southern Monterey Bay, and then you have this wave gradient where you have smaller waves as you move up here to Moss Landing. This is essentially setting up this pressure system for transport. So you get all these large waves that erode down in the south, and especially if that swell is during an El Nino year, which causes all of this erosion, that swell is likely coming from the south and pushing sediment to the north. And so I think that during some of these episodic erosion events, we could be seeing sand that's being transported from there. And so it would follow then that if we cut off this sand mining plant, which is taking all this sand, that we might see the growth of the beach up here, or you might see the complete opposite. It's hard to say.
Good luck.
Yeah.
So I'm the non-scientist in the room, and you know that the beach has been a big part of our lives forever. So, you know, you read and you hear the sky is falling when it comes to erosion, and you can see it in the beaches by our house. Are you feeling that? Do you think the beaches and the height of the water, do you see beaches going away sometime in the next 80 years? Or is erosion that bad?
I think a lot of it depends. Some of the biggest problems are that so many of our beaches are armored in California, meaning that you don't just have this natural dune behind it and this huge buffer of natural environment. You have a home right here. And so in those cases, I definitely think that we will be losing quite a bit of beaches in those areas. In areas like southern Monterey Bay, for example, our beaches here aren't quite as armored, and so there's a much larger buffer. So even if our beaches start to erode, there's still plenty of dune sand behind it that also needs to erode before the beach is going to completely disappear. But you can see a lot of people working to try and combat this. I mean, a large part of it is just that there's no more sand coming into the system because we've dammed so many of our rivers and just modified so many of our natural systems. And so if we can figure out a way to start funneling some of the sand back into the system, then we might be able to preserve some of our beaches a bit better.
So is there a difference between, I guess we could have a beer and probably talk about it. Is there a big difference between the West Coast and East Coast when it comes to erosion?
Yes, there is. So I talked a little bit about these littoral cells, meaning these defined areas of sedimentation, right? So southern Monterey Bay. The reason that we have these on the West Coast is because it's an active margin, meaning that we have plate tectonics and all this sort of subduction happening over here on the West Coast. However, on the East Coast, it's a passive margin, meaning that there's very little, no plate tectonic action there. And so that means that the beaches are much, much wider, and there aren't promontories on the East Coast either. You know, you don't have things like the Monterey Peninsula, you don't have submarine canyons, and so everything's just a bit different there. The systems are very unique.
So I remember at one point that you said you went about this based on the assumption that it was mainly the waves that affected all of this change. Then you listed a couple of other possibilities like human interaction or wind. How much of an effect do you think that possibly has on the beach that you studied, not just the canyon that's quite close to it?
In terms of like how wind might be.
I guess, yeah.
I don't think it has much of an effect, other than the fact that wind is just like this parameter driving some of the locally generated waves that we get here. But I mean, most of the wave action that's really controlling change on the beaches is coming from far off places. It's coming from up off the coast of Alaska, for example, or down south quite a bit. So I don't think something like wind would necessarily influence it. No. At least not local, and obviously wind in these places.
I have a question.
Sure.
So it's not substantive, but I'm interested in the shift from your early years of hating science to your later years of loving science, and could you characterize the reasons for the hate and shift?
Partially teachers, but also partially the fact that I was a kid who just wanted to go outside and play and surf and play baseball. And so most academics weren't all that interesting to me growing up. And then at some point I grew up a little bit and decided it was fun. I mean, especially once you start taking, I switched into environmental studies. So suddenly I'm taking all these classes where I'm going outside all the time, talking about all these things I'm actually interested in, right? And so that's sort of what shifted it for me.
Well, I think we want to thank Mr. Sandman again for this excellent presentation. And please, before you leave, can you put your chair back on that stash there, because there's a class that we taught here in a few minutes, so it will be very helpful. So thank you so much.